The most unsettling thing about the Library of Alexandria is not that it burned, it is that human memory can disappear without a single dramatic moment. A scroll can rot, a room can be abandoned, a language can stop being copied, and after enough quiet losses, an entire path of human thought can vanish as if it had never been real. If knowledge is one of the ways our species survives time, what does it mean when survival itself forgets? The real reason the Library of Alexandria was destroyed, and what was actually lost forever, the story most people carry about the Library of Alexandria is simple enough to fit inside one image: a great building, shelves of scrolls, flames rising through the dark, and knowledge turning to ash. It is a powerful image because it gives loss a shape. It lets the mind point to one moment and say, "There, that is where the wound began." Yet the colder truth is more difficult to hold. Ancient knowledge did not usually disappear like a house struck by lightning. It disappeared more often like a voice that was not answered, like a name no child learned to repeat, like a fragile roll of papyrus left too long in damp air until its fibers loosened and its letters faded into silence. Alexandria matters because it reminds us that memory is not a stone monument, it is a living chain. Every link needs hands, time, money, shelter, and belief. A scroll had to be copied before it decayed. A teacher had to train another reader before his own memory failed. A city had to keep valuing the quiet labor of preserving words, even when armies moved, rulers changed, and ordinary people needed bread more urgently than books. When that chain weakened, a library could still stand in some form, and yet already be losing itself. That is why the famous fire, whether connected with war in the harbour, later destruction, or confused memory from many troubled centuries, cannot by itself explain what was lost. A flame can burn a room. It cannot explain why fewer rooms were rebuilt, why fewer texts were recopied, why scholars moved away, why old languages became harder to read, or why a culture slowly stopped making the same promises to its dead. The beginning of this question reaches far behind Alexandria. Before cities, before palaces, before shelves, human beings survived by carrying knowledge inside bodies and communities. Where water could be found, which plants could feed, which animals were dangerous, which paths returned home. These things lived in memory, gesture, rhythm, and speech. Knowledge was not separate from life. It moved from elder to child, from hand to hand, from one generation's nervous system into the next. Writing changed that ancient arrangement. It allowed a thought to leave the body and wait in the world. A dead person could still speak if someone preserved the surface on which the words remained. The Library of Alexandria became a symbol of that larger human leap, the attempt to gather many dead and distant voices into one place, so that the living could compare them, question them, and continue them. But the same leap carried a hidden danger. Once memory lived on fragile material, it could be lost through neglect as well as violence. Once knowledge depended on institutions, it could weaken when institutions weakened. Once wisdom was stored in rooms, it depended on roofs, taxes, officials, copyists, and readers who had not yet been born. This is the paradox at the center of Alexandria. The library was built because human memory was powerful enough to imagine lasting beyond one lifetime. It was destroyed, in the deepest sense, because human memory was never powerful enough to protect every path it opened. The real loss may not have been a single vanished treasure house, but a long thinning of possibilities. Some works survived elsewhere, some ideas travelled through other cities, other languages, other hands, yet many writings likely did not have enough copies, enough readers, or enough time. They fell out of the human conversation quietly. And when a text disappears completely, we do not only lose its answers, we lose its questions, its mistakes, its unfinished methods, its way of seeing the world. The fire we remember is therefore only the visible edge of a wider human fear that our species can learn, record, gather, and still forget what it once had learned without noticing it. Alexandria became unforgettable because it gave the human mind a single place to mourn an almost impossible loss. Across history, people have lost many libraries, many archives, many schools, and many voices, but the name Alexandria gathers those losses into one quiet symbol. It stands at the edge of the sea, in imagination as much as in geography, holding scrolls from distant cities, poems copied by careful hands, mathematical arguments, medical observations, maps, plays, histories, and commentaries on older works. Whether every detail in the popular image is accurate is less important than why the image has lasted. A library burning is easier to understand than a civilization changing its habits. Flames move quickly. Decline moves through budgets, customs, languages, and generations. A burned scroll can be pictured. A text that was copied one time too few cannot be pictured at all. So the story of Alexandria became a kind of mental shortcut, one disaster standing in for a slower human failure to keep every voice alive. The ancient sources do not leave us with a clean, simple record. Some accounts point toward damage connected with Julius Caesar's war near the harbour. Other memories gather around later violence in the city, changing rulers, religious conflict, or the fate of other scholarly spaces. Modern historians are careful because the evidence is uneven, written at different times, and sometimes shaped by the concerns of the writers who preserved it. There may have been more than one loss, more than one damaged collection, more than one moment when books, buildings, or learned communities were weakened. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. It shows how easily human memory turns a long disorder into a single scene. Long before Alexandria, our species learned through repetition, bodies, and shared attention. A child watched how a tool was held. A path was remembered because many feet had taken it. A warning survived because fear and experience were carried in voice, face, and gesture. Nothing in that early human world guaranteed perfect memory, but knowledge remained close to daily life. Writing created distance. It let a thought travel beyond the speaker, beyond the village, beyond the season. Yet, that distance required new forms of care. A written work could be ignored by people who did not know its language. It could sit in a storeroom where no living reader understood why it mattered. It could survive a battle and still die later from silence. Alexandria grew into a symbol because it sits exactly at that turning point in human imagination, where memory had become grand, organized, and vulnerable at the same time. The city did not merely store words. It suggested that the world could be gathered, arranged, and made searchable by the minds of scholars. That ambition was extraordinary, but it also made the later loss feel larger than any ordinary ruin. When a temple falls, people see stone on the ground. When a harbour silts up, they see ships go elsewhere. But when a centre of learning fades, the emptiness is harder to measure. The shelves may disappear first, or the scholars, or the funds, or the readers. The result is a silence with no exact border. This is why the Library of Alexandria remains so powerful. It is not because the simplest legend is certainly true. It is because the legend protects a deeper anxiety that is true. Human beings depend on inherited knowledge more than any other creature we know, yet inheritance is never automatic. Every generation receives more than it can fully examine and passes on less than it received. The library became the place where that imbalance could be felt, and where absence took on a lasting shape. Behind the famous image of destruction is a slower question. How much of the ancient world vanished? Not because it was hated, but because it was no longer carried forward. If the Library of Alexandria was not simply destroyed by one enemy on one terrible day, then the question becomes less dramatic, but more disturbing. What kind of destruction leaves no clean scar? A city can be conquered and still keep some of its books. A building can burn while other copies survive. A ruler can damage a collection without erasing every reader who once knew its value. The deeper loss begins when many small protections fail at the same time, or one after another, so slowly that no witness understands the full shape of what is happening. A scroll is not only a thing, it is the end point of a long human process. Someone had to prepare the writing surface. Someone had to compose the words. Someone had to copy them carefully enough that the next reader could trust them. Someone had to store them in a place where heat, insects, moisture, and neglect would not take them apart. Someone had to teach others why the words were worth reading. Remove only one of these steps, and a text becomes vulnerable. Remove several across generations, and even a great library begins to die without needing a single final flame. This is why Alexandria asks us to think beyond the pleasure of blame. It may feel satisfying to imagine one villain, one order, one torch, one night, when the ancient world went dark. But accepted historical understanding does not give us that kind of certainty. It gives us a city that changed hands, a royal project that depended on royal support, a scholarly community that depended on scholars remaining there, and a written culture that depended on copying more than possession. The library's fate was tied to the body of Alexandria itself, its harbour, its palaces, its courts, its taxes, its conflicts, its religious life, and its place inside larger empires. When those conditions changed, the meaning of the library changed with them. The roots of this fragility reach back to the beginning of human memory. Our ancestors did not survive because one mind could hold everything. They survived because knowledge moved between minds. A way of making a tool, a pattern in animal movement, a season of hunger, a dangerous plant, a burial custom, a story about origin and belonging. Each survived only by being repeated within a living group. Culture was never stored once and made safe forever. It had to be renewed. Alexandria was one of the most ambitious attempts in the ancient Mediterranean world to renew memory on a larger scale. It tried to gather what many peoples had written, place it under care, and make it available to learned attention. Yet the larger the system, the more it depended on invisible support. The public remembers fire because fire is visible. It does not remember payrolls, catalogues, damaged roofs, lost patronage, retiring teachers, dead copyists, unread languages, or political priorities shifting away from preservation. These quieter forces do not look like destruction at first. They look like ordinary life continuing. A room is closed for a while. A scholar leaves and is not replaced. A damaged role is set aside. A new ruler funds something else. A later generation knows the name of a book but no longer has the book itself. In that way, what was actually destroyed may have been less like a treasure chest smashed open and more like a living habitat drying out. The scrolls were only the visible creatures. Around them was an ecosystem of readers, scribes, teachers, collectors, translators, and rulers who believed that gathering old words mattered. When the ecosystem weakened, the surviving pieces could scatter. Some texts travelled elsewhere and lived. Some were absorbed into later traditions, some were quoted in fragments, others likely disappeared so completely that no title remains to mourn. The real question, then, is not only who destroyed the Library of Alexandria, it is what had to stop happening for such a place to become impossible to preserve. Alexandria was never only a place where books were kept. Before it became a symbol of vanished knowledge, it was a living city pressed against the Mediterranean, built where land, water, trade, empire, and language met one another every day. Its position mattered. Ships could arrive from the Aegean, the Levant, Egypt, Cyprus, and farther routes that connected people across the ancient world. Grain moved through its harbour. Merchants brought goods, rumours, measurements, letters, stories, and habits of thought. Soldiers carried orders. Officials carried records. Travellers carried names of places that many residents would never see. A city like this did not gather knowledge by accident. It gathered knowledge because movement gathered there first. The sea made Alexandria open, but not in a gentle or simple way. A port is a place of exchange, yet also a place of pressure. Many languages can be heard near ships and warehouses. Many laws and loyalties may overlap in the same streets. Greek administrators, Egyptian traditions, Jewish communities, traders from distant coasts, and people bound to labour all belonged in different ways to the same urban body. The great storehouse of texts was born inside that body, not above it. To understand why it could rise, and why it could later weaken, we have to see the city as more than scenery. It was the environment that fed the whole project. Human beings had always depended on environments that could hold memory. In the earliest communities, a landscape was not empty ground. It was a map of survival learned slowly through bodies, where water returned, where animals passed, where stone could be shaped, where shelter could be found, where danger had once appeared. Knowledge was tied to place because life was tied to place. Alexandria changed the scale of that old human pattern. Instead of one valley, one coast, or one seasonal path holding a group's experience, a planned royal city tried to make the wider world pass through itself. The harbour became a kind of moving memory. Every ship might bring not only cargo, but a new text, a copied poem, a medical recipe, an astronomical note, a royal decree, or a story from another shore. This did not mean every voice was equal, or that every tradition was preserved with fairness. Alexandria was also shaped by conquest and hierarchy. It was founded under Macedonian power in Egypt, and its institutions reflected the ambitions of rulers who wanted to organize the world from their own center. That fact matters because the title of this story is not simply about a lost building. It is about the real reason such a place could be built, and then become fragile. The same political force that gave Alexandria wealth, order, and prestige also made its culture dependent on systems that could change. A port city can fill with scrolls when kings want prestige. It can lose its scholarly heartbeat when priorities move elsewhere. Still, in its strongest centuries, Alexandria offered something unusual: density. People, goods, texts, money, and questions were crowded together. A scholar could compare versions of a poem. A geographer could hear reports from sailors. A physician could inherit observations from older traditions. A translator could stand between languages. The city's streets, markets, docks, temples, palaces, and neighborhoods were all connected to the fate of written memory. If Alexandria had been isolated, the famous collection could not have become what it was. It needed traffic. It needed empire. It needed ambition. It needed the ordinary noise of a city where the human habit of carrying knowledge from one life to another had been expanded into an urban machine. And because it was an urban machine, it could not be protected by shelves alone. Its survival depended on the sea remaining useful, rulers remaining interested, communities remaining active, and readers continuing to believe that distant voices were worth bringing into the present with care. The famous collection at Alexandria belonged to a wider world of rooms, people, habits, and royal purpose. It was connected with the palace district and with the learned community often remembered as the Mausian, a place not exactly like a modern museum, but more like a home for scholars under royal protection. To imagine only shelves is to miss the living structure around them. A scroll, sitting alone, does not create knowledge. It has to be selected, compared, corrected, catalogued, taught, quoted, and copied. The ancient library was therefore less like a locked treasure room and more like a working memory system. Its value came from motion. Texts entered. Readers examined them. Copyists made new versions. Scholars argued over words, dates, meanings, and measurements. A poem might be compared with an older copy. A medical observation might be placed beside another tradition. Knowledge was not simply stored there, it was handled, and because it was handled, it depended on the hands. Those hands needed food, pay, training, shelter, and the approval of rulers who believed that such quiet work increased the dignity of their kingdom. This is one reason the real destruction of Alexandria cannot be reduced to broken walls. If the scholars leave, the system weakens. If the copyists stop copying, the texts begin to age towards silence. If the catalogues are lost, even surviving scrolls become harder to use. If royal interest fades, the rooms may remain, but the force that made them meaningful is already thinning. Human knowledge has always required more than memory itself. In the deep past of our species, before writing, a useful skill survived only when someone demonstrated it and someone else watched long enough to learn. A way of shaping stone, reading weather, preparing food, or finding a path through difficult land had to live in repeated action. No single body could preserve a culture after death. The group had to carry it. Alexandria enlarged that same ancient pattern into an institution. Instead of one family line preserving one practice, a city under royal power tried to gather many lines of written memory and hold them together. This was a remarkable human achievement, but it did not remove the older problem. It only changed its form. The chain still had to be renewed. A scholar replaced an elder, a copyist replaced a storyteller, a catalogue replaced a remembered path. A reading room replaced the circle around a fire. The system looked more permanent because it had buildings and official support, yet it was still alive only while people continued the work. The Ptolemaic rulers had strong reasons to support such a project. Alexandria was a new capital in an old land, and scholarship helped give it authority. To possess texts from many places was to claim a kind of command over time and distance. To invite learned people was to make the city appear not only rich, but central to the learned world of the Eastern Mediterranean. This did not mean the library was a neutral paradise of knowledge. It was tied to power, prestige, and political display, but that connection helps explain both its rise and its danger. When knowledge is protected because it serves the image of power, it can suffer when power needs a different image. The quiet labour of preserving old writings may seem less urgent during war, financial strain, religious change, administrative reorganization, or dynastic conflict. Nothing has to be hated in order to be neglected. Nothing has to be officially erased in order to become unsupported. The library was a social body, not just a physical place. Its life depended on many organs working together: acquisition, storage, scholarship, copying, teaching, translation, patronage, and reputation. Damage to any one of these could be repaired if the others remained strong. But when several weakened across generations, destruction could arrive without a single final command. Alexandria was not simply a container of scrolls. It was a rare arrangement of people and resources that made the past readable. Once that arrangement began to fail, the loss had already begun. What was lost at Alexandria cannot be measured only by counting scrolls. A book is precious, but a book without a world around it becomes harder to understand with every generation. The true strength of the library was that many writings were gathered near people who knew how to read them, question them, compare them, and pass them onward. A mathematical text could sit beside older observations. A poem could be checked against another copy. A history could be weighed against a different account from another city. A physician might inherit notes from earlier traditions and place them beside what he had seen in living bodies. The value was not simply possession, it was relationship. Texts became more useful because they could meet other texts, and because trained minds could notice where they agreed, where they differed, and where something had been copied wrongly or misunderstood. This kind of work is quiet, but it is one of the deepest forms of human memory. From the beginning, our species survived by comparing. One person saw a track in wet ground, another remembered the same shape near danger. A group learned that one berry nourished while another sickened. A tool broke, then someone changed the angle, the stone, or the pressure of the hand. Human knowledge grew not because every experience was correct, but because experience could be shared, tested, and adjusted inside a community. Alexandria turned that ancient human habit into a scholarly environment. Instead of comparing only memories around a fire or skills in a camp, scholars compared written voices separated by distance and time. A dead author could be placed beside another dead author. A sailor's report could be considered with a map. A religious poem could become part of a larger conversation about language, ancestry, and power. In such a place, knowledge did not remain frozen. It moved through attention. That is why the loss of the library was not only the loss of individual works, though that alone would have been serious. It was the weakening of a place where old knowledge could be made usable again. A scroll stored in darkness might survive for a while, but without readers it became nearly asleep. A text copied without care could drift from its older form. A difficult work without teachers could become a sealed object, present but unreachable. The environment around the books was what kept them awake. It gave them context, correction, and continuation. Once that environment thinned, some losses became almost impossible to see. A missing commentary might make a surviving poem harder to read. A lost catalogue might hide the memory that a certain work ever existed. A damaged scientific treatise might leave later readers with a conclusion but not the observations that supported it. These are not dramatic losses in the way fire is dramatic. They are quieter, more like a path through a forest no longer used until leaves cover it and no one remembers where it led. The same thing can happen in any human culture. Knowledge does not vanish only when enemies attack it. It can vanish when fewer people know how to care for it. Alexandria matters because it shows how far human beings had come in building memory beyond the body, and how dependent that memory remained on living communities. The library gathered voices, but the gathering itself required daily renewal. It needed readers who understood old scripts, scholars who cared about accuracy, copyists who could preserve fragile works, rulers who allowed time and resources, and students who would carry the labor into another generation. When those conditions weakened, what disappeared was not only paper, ink, or shelving. It was a way of making the human past speak clearly to the human present. In that sense, Alexandria was less a container than a meeting place across time, and the deepest loss was the breaking of that meeting itself. A scroll looks calm when we imagine it on a shelf, but in the ancient world it was always closer to decay than to safety. Papyrus was made from a plant, cut, pressed, dried, and joined into a surface that could carry ink, but it remained organic matter. It could split, darken, curl, fray, stain, or be eaten. A careless hand could damage an edge. Damp air could soften fibers. Heat could make a roll brittle. Insects and rodents could turn stored learning into scattered dust. Even in Egypt, where dry conditions sometimes helped preserve ancient writing, a busy coastal city was not a sealed desert tomb. Alexandria faced sea air, crowded rooms, human use, and the ordinary wear of time. Every scroll had a body, and every body needed care. This is easy to forget because modern readers often meet old texts as printed pages or digital files, already stabilized by centuries of copying and editing. But for an ancient scholar, a work was not an abstract thing floating safely above material life. It was a roll that had to be unrolled, touched, read in light, rolled again, stored again, and eventually copied before its substance failed. The first human memories were also carried by bodies, but those bodies were living. A gesture could be corrected while the elder was still there. A tool technique could be shown again. A warning about a river, a season, or an animal path could be repeated until the young remembered it. Writing allowed knowledge to outlive the speaker, yet it also placed that knowledge inside another fragile body, one made of plant fiber, ink, glue, shelves, labels, and human attention. This was not a small problem at Alexandria. A great collection did not become safe merely by becoming large. In some ways, size increased the need for order. Many rolls meant many titles, many versions, many damaged edges, many uncertain attributions, and many chances for confusion. A text copied from an older text could preserve it, but it could also carry mistakes forward. A tired copyist might skip a line. A rare word might be misunderstood. A damaged original might force a reader to guess. Scholars in places like Alexandria were valuable because they tried to reduce that uncertainty. They compared copies, marked doubtful readings, organized works, and helped later readers know what they were holding. The library's physical vulnerability, therefore, had an intellectual side. When a scroll weakened, the words weakened. When the words became uncertain, the chain of understanding weakened with them. No flame was required for this slow danger. Time itself was enough, unless people worked against it. That labor connects Alexandria to the oldest pattern of human survival. Our species has never kept knowledge by possession alone. A stone tool kept in a hand teaches nothing if no one learns how it was made. A path across a harsh landscape is not knowledge unless someone can follow it and show another person where to turn. A scroll in a room is similar. It is a stored possibility, not a living memory, until a reader enters the chain. The material body of ancient knowledge required repeated human renewal, and renewal required institutions. There had to be people trained in scripts and languages. There had to be time for slow reading. There had to be money for copies, storage, and repair. There had to be a reason, shared by rulers and scholars, to believe that old words deserved protection. When those conditions existed, fragile papyrus could carry thought across centuries. When they weakened, even a collection that had not burned could begin losing the future. The real sorrow of Alexandria is partly that its treasure was never made of treasure. It was made of perishable surfaces, human patience, and a long promise that someone would keep copying before silence arrived. A written work in the ancient world was never safe simply because it existed. It had to be wanted again. It had to be useful enough, beautiful enough, sacred enough, prestigious enough, or familiar enough for someone to spend hours copying it by hand. This was the quiet rule behind every library before printing. A scroll could rest on a shelf, but time was always moving through it. If no one copied it before the papyrus weakened, the work could vanish without war. If only one damaged copy remained, a whole author might be reduced to a few uncertain lines. If a text was difficult, unfashionable, written in a language fewer people knew, or disconnected from the needs of later readers, it became easier to leave behind. Nothing in this process required hatred. Forgetting could happen through preference, exhaustion, expense, or simple change. Alexandria held many writings, but holding was not the same as preserving forever. Preservation meant repetition, and repetition depended on people. The copyist was therefore one of the most important figures in the life of ancient knowledge. He might not create the poem, history, or observation he copied, yet his hand stood between survival and disappearance. A roll had to be read line by line and reproduced with enough accuracy that a future reader could still meet the older voice. Mistakes were possible. Margins could confuse. Abbreviations could be misunderstood. A phrase skipped by the eye might never return. Still, copying was the bridge across time. Before writing, human memory also depended on repeated transfer, but the transfer happened through living presence. A child learned by watching hands make a tool, hearing a story repeated, recognizing when others approved or corrected a gesture. The ancient body was the first library. Muscles remembered, ears remembered, eyes remembered, communities remembered through practice. Writing moved memory outside the body, but it did not remove the need for repeated teaching. It simply created a new kind of ancestor, the absent speaker whose words survived only when living people kept renewing the surface. This is why a library was never only a room. It was an agreement between generations. The dead offered their words, but the living had to keep answering. For Alexandria, that agreement was unusually ambitious. Works from different places could be copied, stored, compared, and made available to scholars trained to notice details. Yet the same ambition made the system costly. A large collection required workers, catalogues, storage, repair, and educated readers. It required people who could tell one version from another, identify a corrupted line, or decide which writings deserved scarce attention. When many texts compete for limited hands, selection becomes unavoidable. Some works are copied often because they are admired, taught, or needed. Others are copied rarely. A rare work may still exist for a while, but it lives near the edge. One flood, one neglectful decade, one change in language, one loss of interest, and the thread may break. The real loss at Alexandria was therefore not only an event that happened to objects, it was a thinning of desire around certain voices. A society can lose a book because no enemy destroys it, but also because no friend remains close enough to save it. We prefer to imagine that knowledge is lost when violent people attack it from outside, but knowledge also dies when people who might have protected it become too poor, too busy, too divided, too far away, or too unsure of its value. In that sense, the fate of Alexandria touches a much older human condition. Every generation receives more memory than it can carry. It must choose, even when it does not admit that it is choosing. The Library of Alexandria tried to enlarge what could be carried, but even there, the future depended on fragile acts repeated in quiet rooms. A scroll survived when someone opened it, understood it, copied it, and gave it another chance to wait for a reader not yet born. Long before any scroll was placed in Alexandria, human memory lived in breath, muscle, and repeated attention. A group remembered because people gathered, listened, watched, corrected, and tried again. The first tools were not protected by catalogues. They were protected by hands that knew the pressure of stone against stone. The first maps were not drawn on parchment. They were held in feet that had crossed the same ground, in eyes that recognized a bend of river, a line of hills, a tree that marked the way back. The first histories were not arranged on shelves. They moved through stories, gestures, mourning, warning, and names. This older form of memory was limited, but it was also deeply embodied. It could fade when elders died or communities scattered, yet while it lived, it was tied to action. Knowledge was renewed each time someone performed it. Writing changed the human relationship with time. It allowed a thought to wait outside the body. A person could die, and a sentence could remain. A law, A poem, a list of stars, a medical observation, or a record of rulers could travel farther than the voice that first shaped it. This was one of the great transformations in human history, not because it made memory perfect, but because it made memory separable. The mind could leave a trace that another mind might meet later. Alexandria stood near the height of that transformation in the ancient Mediterranean world. It represented the hope that written traces from many peoples could be gathered and made to speak across distance. But the same transformation carried a quiet danger. Once memory leaves the living body, it must be protected by other bodies of matter. Papyrus, ink, wood, clay, stone, leather, shelves, buildings, and systems of care. A spoken warning can vanish in one generation if no one repeats it. A written warning can last longer, but only if its surface survives, its script remains readable, and its meaning is still taught. The Library of Alexandria was therefore built on a fragile exchange. Human beings extended memory beyond flesh, but they entrusted it to materials that could age, institutions that could weaken, and communities that could forget why certain words mattered. This is the deep connection between the library and the beginning of human knowledge. Our species did not become powerful because each individual knew so much. It became powerful because knowledge could accumulate outside any one life. A child did not need to discover everything again. A young healer could inherit observations. A navigator could inherit distances. A scholar could inherit arguments made centuries earlier and begin from there. Alexandria was a grand expression of that inheritance. It gathered inherited minds. Yet inheritance is never automatic. It must be received. It must be interpreted. It must be copied with care. It must be protected from both violence and indifference. When people ask what was actually lost forever, the answer cannot be only a list of missing books. The deeper loss is the broken continuation of human attempts to think beyond their own lifetime. Some ancient works may have contained errors. Some may have been ordinary. Some may have been brilliant in ways we can no longer judge. Others may have preserved local observations, lost versions of older stories, or arguments that later writers never had the chance to answer. Even a mistaken text can matter because it shows how a human mind tried to organize the world with the tools available at the time. What makes disappearance serious is not that every lost scroll would have changed the world. It is that we no longer know which paths of thought were closed before later generations could walk them. Writing gave humanity a second memory, but not an immortal one. Alexandria teaches that the second memory can fail too, not because it was weak in imagination, but because it remained dependent on fragile matter and living care. The Library of Alexandria was not born from pure curiosity alone, it was also born from power. After Alexander's conquests reshaped the eastern Mediterranean, Egypt came under a Macedonian Greek dynasty known as the Ptolemies, and Alexandria became their capital. These rulers governed an ancient land while presenting themselves through a newer royal identity, one tied to Greek language, court culture, military authority, and Mediterranean ambition. In that setting, knowledge was not a gentle ornament placed beside politics. It was one way politics learned to speak with a deeper voice. A king who gathered armies could command bodies. A king who gathered books could appear to command time. The Ptolemaic project at Alexandria used scholarship to say that the new capital was not merely another city on the coast, but a centre where the memory of many peoples could be collected, ordered, and displayed under royal care. This does not mean every detail of the library's founding can be described with perfect certainty. Ancient testimony is uneven, and later writers sometimes shape the story through admiration or legend. But the broad pattern is clear enough to handle with care. Royal patronage helped make Alexandria a learned centre, and that patronage gave the collection a scale ordinary private effort could not have achieved. Scholars needed support. Copyists needed wages. Buildings needed maintenance. Texts had to be acquired, stored, arranged, and protected. Such work required wealth, administration, and a reason powerful enough to make rulers pay for quiet labour that did not feed an army or build a wall. Prestige supplied that reason. In the very old history of human groups, leaders gained status by securing food, settling disputes, remembering roots, or preserving the stories that joined a community together. Authority often grew from the ability to protect what a group needed to survive. Alexandria extended that ancient pattern into a royal city. The Ptolemies could not become Egyptian pharaohs in the old way without also negotiating the traditions already rooted in the Nile Valley. They could not rule the Greek-speaking world by conquest alone. Scholarship offered another kind of legitimacy. A court that welcomed poets, mathematicians, physicians, grammarians, and philosophers suggested that its rulers were guardians of civilization, not only holders of force. To own rare writings, or to be associated with their preservation, was to stand near the ancestors of thought. The library, therefore, became a political instrument, though not a false one. A tool of power can still produce real learning. Patronage may be motivated by pride, and still allow careful minds to do honest work. That is one of the quiet complexities of Alexandria. The same royal ambition that made the library possible also made it meaningful to scholars who may have cared far more about language, medicine, mathematics, or poetry than about dynastic image. Power built the shelter. Thought filled it with life. Yet the shelter remained dependent on power. A collection created under royal favour could flourish when kings saw it as useful to their prestige. It could become vulnerable when rulers faced war, debt, conflict, succession struggles, or other needs that seemed more urgent. Knowledge protected by authority is never completely free from authority's changing weather. The ancient human chain of memory had always needed a social setting. A skill survived because people made time to teach it. A story survived because a group kept space for telling it. A written culture survived because someone paid for the copying and respected the reader's work. Alexandria's greatness came from the unusual concentration of those conditions in one city. Its danger came from the same concentration. If the court withdrew interest, if funds weakened, if learned people lost their place, the collection would not remain equally alive simply because scrolls still existed. The kings who built memory also revealed memory's dependence. They showed that knowledge can rise quickly when power chooses to honour it, and that it can become fragile when that honour is no longer renewed. To gather books in Alexandria was to gather more than written objects. It was to gather authority over what counted as the usable past. The Ptolemaic rulers understood that a city could become powerful not only by controlling ships, grain, soldiers, and taxes, but by becoming the place where educated people believed the world's words should arrive. A scroll brought into the royal collection was not merely stored, it became part of a larger statement that Alexandria was worthy to receive, arrange, and judge the memory of others. Stories about how aggressively the Ptolemies acquired texts must be treated carefully, because ancient anecdotes can grow sharper with repetition. Yet the general ambition is not difficult to see. The court wanted books, it wanted scholars, it wanted a reputation that could reach beyond Egypt and make the city feel central to Greek-speaking learning. To invite poets, grammarians, mathematicians, physicians, astronomers, and philosophers was to turn scholarship into a form of royal display. A ruler did not need to understand every argument in every scroll for the institution to serve him. The presence of learned people itself became a sign of cultivated power. Their debates, editions, measurements, and catalogues showed that the kingdom could support slow attention, not only immediate command. This mattered because ancient knowledge was not self-organizing. A mass of rolls without trained readers could become confusion. Titles could be uncertain. Authors could be disputed. Copies could disagree. Older words could be damaged, misread, or mixed with later editions. The Alexandrian project gave scholars a setting where such problems could be handled with unusual concentration. They could compare versions, refine texts, produce commentaries, and create tools that helped others find their way through abundance. In the oldest human communities, knowledge also needed people who knew how to sort experience. Not every sound in the night meant danger, not every plant was food, not every path returned to water. Survival depended on the ability to compare signs, remember outcomes, and teach distinctions. Alexandria carried that ancient human work into writing. It took the sorting mind of the camp, the coastline, and the valley, and enlarged it into a court-supported world of texts. This was not only collecting, it was organized attention. The library's shelves mattered because the people around them could turn stored words into usable knowledge. And because that attention required support, the royal role remained central. Scholars needed the freedom to spend time on questions that might not produce immediate wealth. A grammarian studying the correct line of a poem, or an astronomer comparing observations, was engaged in labour that depended on a society willing to protect non-urgent thought. The Ptolemies could protect it because it also served them. Their city appeared refined, stable, and connected to older prestige. Their dynasty could present itself as heir to the learned world, even though it had risen from conquest. This mixture of sincerity and strategy is important. It prevents a simple story in which knowledge is pure and power is only corrupting. At Alexandria, power helped create the conditions for real scholarship. But those conditions were not independent. They were built into the court, the palace district, the economy, and the political needs of rulers. If the crown changed its priorities, the library's living structure could change with it. If later rulers had less money, less stability, less interest, or a different vision of legitimacy, the scholars could not preserve the same world by desire alone. The collection may have seemed grand, but grandeur did not make it immune to history. The same ambition that gathered books also tied them to the fortunes of a dynasty and a city. That is why the real reason for Alexandria's loss begins to look less like a single act of destruction and more like a dependency slowly exposed. Knowledge had been raised high by royal hands, and high things can fall when the hands beneath them grow tired, distracted, or gone. The paradox of Alexandria is that power helped memory grow beyond ordinary limits. And power also made memory vulnerable to forces that scholarship could not control. A small group of readers might keep a poem alive in private rooms. A teacher might preserve a method through students. A family, a temple, or a local school might guard certain writings for a time. But the scale associated with Alexandria required more than private devotion. It required royal attention, organized space, trained labor, and wealth that only a major court could provide. This gave the library its extraordinary reach. It also tied its life to the changing needs of rulers. When a king wished to appear as a guardian of learning, the gathering of books could become an act of state. When another ruler needed soldiers, payments, alliances, loyalty, or religious legitimacy more urgently, the same quiet labor could begin to seem less central. Knowledge does not have to be attacked in order to lose protection. It only has to become less useful to those who pay for its shelter. This is a difficult truth because people often imagine learning as something separate from the world around it. A mathematical proof seems cleaner than politics. A poem seems to breathe in a more private air. A medical note seems to belong to the body, not the throne. Yet in the ancient world, as in many later worlds, the survival of such things depended on very practical conditions. Someone had to provide rooms where scholars could work. Someone had to maintain collections. Someone had to support those whose labor moved slowly, line by line, name by name, comparison by comparison. Without that support, even careful thought could become homeless. This reaches back to the human beginning in a quiet way. Before writing, knowledge survived because a group made space for it inside daily life. People stopped long enough to teach. They repeated what mattered. They allowed the young to watch, fail, and try again. If hunger, migration, conflict, or death broke that teaching chain, knowledge could disappear even when no one chose to destroy it. Alexandria enlarged the teaching chain into an institution, but the principle remained the same. Memory needs a social body. Remove the body, and the memory weakens. The rulers who supported Alexandria gave scholars a body large enough to hold many voices. But no royal body is permanent. Courts change. Capitals shift in importance. Dynasties weaken. Wars consume attention. Administrators reorganize money. New forms of prestige replace old ones. A ruler may still respect learning in words while no longer sustaining the exact conditions that learning requires. In that gap, decline can begin quietly. The shelves may remain for a while. Some scholars may continue their work. Some books may still be read. Nothing needs to look like a final ending, but the system becomes less able to repair itself. Fewer copies are made. Fewer teachers are replaced. Fewer difficult texts receive attention. A damaged roll waits too long. A catalogue is no longer updated. A name becomes known only because another writer once mentioned it. In such moments, loss looks almost ordinary. The day still has meals, markets, prayers, arguments, and weather. People continue living, while one thin thread between the dead and the unborn grows weaker. This is how a great memory can thin across generations. The real reason Alexandria became fragile then was not that knowledge was weak, but that knowledge had been made strong through supports that were themselves historical. The library rose from human ambition, royal wealth, urban density, and the ancient desire to let one generation speak to another. It weakened when those supports could no longer be renewed with the same force. That does not give us one clean villain. It gives us something more unsettling. A world in which even the highest achievements of memory remain dependent on ordinary, changing human arrangements. The first serious crack in Alexandria may have appeared before any famous image of flames. It may have begun when the conditions that made scholarship possible started to lose their old stability. A library can seem solid from the outside. It may have walls, rooms, shelves, catalogues, and the memory of a great name. But a centre of learning depends on something less visible than stone. It depends on a steady stream of support, on rulers who continue to value slow thought, on scholars who believe the city is still worth their lives, and on younger students who see a future in learning there. When those things weaken, a library does not immediately vanish. It becomes quieter. The work becomes harder to sustain. A place once known for gathering minds can begin to lose them one by one. Ancient writers suggest that Alexandria's learned community was affected by political struggles and changing royal fortunes, and modern historians usually treat the decline as a long process rather than a single collapse. That caution matters. We do not need to imagine a sudden emptying of every room to understand the damage. A few dismissed scholars, a court less generous than before, a conflict that makes study feel unsafe, a ruler more concerned with survival than prestige, and the old rhythm begins to change. The library's life had always been tied to the court. When the court was strong, scholarship could be made to look like royal glory. When the court became unstable, scholarship became easier to neglect. This is not because poems, maps, medical writings, or mathematical works lost their value in themselves. It is because value must be acted upon to remain alive. Someone has to keep paying for the quiet tasks that make preservation possible. Someone has to keep inviting teachers, copying texts, maintaining rooms, and training readers who can understand difficult works. Without that ongoing care, knowledge becomes like a seed left outside the season. It may still contain life, but the conditions for growth are fading. This returns us to the oldest human pattern. Long before cities, the loss of knowledge often began when a teaching chain was interrupted. If a group moved away from a familiar landscape, old paths could lose meaning. If skilled elders died before the young had learned enough, certain techniques could weaken. If a small community was scattered by hunger, disease, or violence, memory could survive in fragments but lose its setting. Alexandria was far larger and more literate, yet the same rule remained. Knowledge needs continuity. A scholar is not only an individual mind, he is also a bridge between older texts and future readers. When such bridges disappear, the writing left behind becomes harder to cross. The first crack, then, was not necessarily a visible wound in the building. It was a change in the human population around the books. A learned centre can survive damage if enough trained people remain to repair, copy, teach, and reorganize. But if the people leave, die, are dismissed, or are no longer replaced, the collection loses its living guardians. The silence grows gently. A difficult work waits for someone who no longer comes. A student who might have become a careful editor chooses another city, another patron, another way to live. A teacher takes his memory elsewhere. A text remains present, but the conversation around it thins. In the history of Alexandria, there were still scholars and intellectual life in different periods, and no honest account should pretend that learning ended all at once. The city remained important for a long time, but the special concentration that had once made the library extraordinary could weaken without disappearing in a single day. That is what makes the loss so human. The fall of knowledge is often not a dramatic descent. It is a slow lowering of attention. The real wound begins when a society no longer renews the people who know how to keep memory awake. A library can survive as a name long after its living centre has changed. People may still point toward a district, a building, a memory of scholars, or a reputation inherited from earlier generations. Yet the real life of such a place is not contained in the name. It is contained in daily practices that are easy to overlook because they do not look heroic. Someone opens a roll and notices damage. Someone compares two copies and sees that a line has drifted. Someone teaches a student how to read an older form of Greek, how to recognize a doubtful attribution, how to respect a text without trusting it blindly. Someone knows where a certain work is kept, or which catalogue entry refers to which author, or why one version should be treated with caution. Remove these people, and the library becomes less intelligent, even before it becomes smaller. The shelves may still hold scrolls, but the rooms no longer know themselves in the same way. This kind of change is difficult to record. Ancient writers were more likely to notice dramatic acts, famous scholars, royal quarrels, or public violence than the slow loss of ordinary expertise. A later observer might see that Alexandria still had learned men and still carried an old prestige, yet miss how much of the earlier system had thinned. The departure of one scholar is a personal event. The failure to replace many scholars is a historical wound. The loss of one catalogue is an inconvenience. The fading of cataloguing habits is a change in civilization. What makes this especially important is that ancient texts were not easy to use without guidance. Many works existed in variants. Titles could be uncertain. Authors could be confused with later imitators. Technical writings could assume knowledge that had once been taught aloud. A medical note, a mathematical proof, or a grammatical argument might survive physically and still become harder to enter if the teaching environment around it weakened. This returns us to the first human forms of knowledge. A stone blade alone does not explain the hand that shaped it. A footprint alone does not teach the path unless someone knows the land around it. A story alone can lose force if the listeners no longer share the places, fears, and needs that gave it meaning. Human memory began as a relationship between signs and living interpreters. Alexandria preserved written signs on a scale earlier communities could not have imagined, but it still needed interpreters. When those interpreters became fewer, scattered, or less supported, the signs lost some of their power to continue. That is why the weakening of a scholarly community can be more serious than damage to one room. A room can be repaired if the knowledge of repair remains. Scrolls can be recopied if trained hands and readers still exist. A collection can be reorganized if people remember the principles by which it once made sense. But when the living memory around the collection grows thin, recovery becomes harder with each passing generation. Later scholars may preserve fragments, quote older works, or carry some traditions elsewhere, and those survivals matter. They warn us not to imagine total darkness falling at once. Yet survival in fragments is not the same as survival in a living center. The old force of comparison, correction, teaching, and renewal becomes weaker. Alexandria's body may have continued in different forms, but its earlier heartbeat depended on a dense community of people doing careful work together. When that density changed, the library's destruction had already entered a quieter stage. The loss was no longer only what happened to objects. It was what happened to the minds that knew how to keep those objects meaningful, and to the younger minds that might have learned the same patience if the chain had remained strong enough to reach them. The deepest weakness in Alexandria was not only political or material, it was generational. A library can be damaged in a war, but a tradition is damaged when the people who know how to continue it are no longer formed in the same way. Every learned place depends on a sequence of lives. An older scholar teaches a younger one how to read patiently. A copyist learns how to move through a line without losing a word. A student learns which questions have already been asked, which answers are uncertain, and which older voices deserve caution rather than blind trust. None of this can be stored fully in a scroll. A scroll can preserve sentences, but it cannot preserve the entire discipline of using them well. That discipline lives between people. It lives in correction, example, memory, and habit. When a learned community weakens, the loss often begins there, in the space between one generation and the next. Alexandria had once concentrated many such bridges. Its strength was not merely that it possessed writings from different places, but that it held people capable of carrying those writings forward. If the city produced fewer readers trained to understand difficult works, then the collection became less reachable. If fewer copyists were paid to renew aging rolls, then the past began to depend on increasingly fragile surfaces. If fewer teachers remain to explain context, language, and method, then even surviving words could become more distant. This is how human knowledge has always been endangered. In the earliest communities of our species, knowledge was not preserved by objects alone. A stone tool left on the ground could not teach its maker's full intelligence. A hearth, a path, a pattern of migration, or a way of preparing food needed living demonstration. The young had to see, imitate, fail, and be corrected. If that chain broke, the object might remain while the skill disappeared. Alexandria transformed that ancient chain into a literate institution, but it did not escape the rule. Written culture still required apprenticeship. A text might wait silently for centuries, but only if enough human beings kept renewing the ability to read it. The danger was not always sudden. It could happen through small demographic shifts. A scholar dies and has no equal successor nearby. A family sends its children toward administration, trade, or military service rather than study. A patron no longer supports a circle of readers. A language becomes less central to public life. A school moves elsewhere. The city remains crowded, but the specific population needed to keep the library alive becomes thinner. This kind of loss leaves few ruins. Archaeology can sometimes find walls, objects, inscriptions, or traces of buildings, but it cannot easily recover the missing conversation between teacher and student. It cannot restore the tone of a correction, the memory of why one manuscript was trusted more than another, or the shared assumptions that made a technical sentence clear. That is why the destruction of Alexandria must be imagined not only as damage to things, but as damage to continuity. The library depended on generations arriving in time to receive what older generations had prepared. When that arrival failed, knowledge did not fall like a tower. It drifted out of reach. Some works may have survived through other centers of learning, and the later history of science, philosophy, medicine, and literature did not begin from emptiness. It would be false to pretend that all ancient knowledge died there, yet it would also be false to think that survival elsewhere made the loss harmless. A text copied in one place might live, while its commentaries vanished. A famous author might survive, while rival voices disappeared. A field of study might continue, but with fewer alternative paths. The missing generation is often invisible, because what it would have preserved has no later witness. Alexandria reminds us that human knowledge is not a pile of facts. It is a lineage, like a line of careful breathing across time. Each generation inhales what it can, and exhales only what it manages to carry. When the breath is interrupted, the silence that follows may never announce what it has taken. The fire connected with Julius Caesar is the most famous doorway into the story, because it gives the mind what it wants: a date, a battle, a recognizable name, and a visible cause. In 48 BCE, Caesar was in Alexandria during a dangerous struggle for power in Egypt. Fighting reached the harbour, and ancient accounts describe fire being used around ships and nearby areas. From that scene grew one of the most persistent ideas about the Library of Alexandria, that flames spread from the waterfront and destroyed the great collection. It is not impossible that books or storage areas were damaged. It is reasonable to say that some written material may have been lost in the fighting, but it is not careful to say that Caesar certainly burned the entire library in one clear final disaster. The evidence does not allow that kind of simple ending. Ancient writers do not all tell the same story in the same way. Some refer to books burned near the harbour, some later traditions enlarge the damage. Other signs suggest that scholarly life in Alexandria did not simply end at that moment. A cautious account must hold these pieces together without forcing them into a legend more complete than the evidence. The fire matters, but it may matter less as the single death of the library than as one wound in a body already tied to political danger. A harbour fire can burn what is near it. It can destroy warehouses, ships, stored goods, and possibly collections of texts awaiting copying, export, or protection. Yet a true intellectual centre is not only what stands at the waterfront. It includes rooms, scholars, habits, catalogues, patrons, and copies held elsewhere. If all of those continued in some measure afterward, then the story cannot end in Caesar's flames. This does not make the fire harmless. In the ancient world, even a limited loss could be serious. A group of scrolls might contain works with few other copies. A damaged store could remove versions, commentaries, or records that later scholars needed. The loss of written material is rarely equal to the size of the building that burns. A small room can contain a large silence if the works inside it are not copied again. This brings the question back to the beginning of human memory. For most of our species' existence, knowledge survived by being distributed among many people. No single fire could destroy everything a group knew if the knowledge still lived in bodies, habits, songs, and practiced hands. Writing gave memory a new power, but also a new concentration. A text stored in one place could carry a mind across centuries, yet if too few copies existed, it could also vanish in one local accident. Alexandria's strength was concentration. Its weakness was concentration. The more a culture gathers precious memory into certain rooms, the more those rooms become meaningful targets for chance, war, decay, and neglect. Caesar's fire therefore reveals a cold truth even if it did not destroy the entire library. It shows how fragile written inheritance could be when war entered the spaces where memory was stored. Soldiers did not need to understand the scrolls to endanger them. Flames did not need to hate philosophy, poetry, medicine, or mathematics. Fire simply followed fuel and air. That is why the story is so powerful and so misleading at the same time. It is powerful because something real about ancient vulnerability is present in it. It is misleading because it tempts us to replace centuries of slow weakening with one famous man and one dramatic night. The real history is quieter and more uneven. Caesar's Alexandria may have suffered damage, perhaps serious damage to some written materials, but the larger death of the library cannot be placed safely inside that single blaze. The fire becomes a symbol of how knowledge can be wounded by events that are not about knowledge at all. To say that Caesar's fire may have damaged books is not the same as saying it ended the Library of Alexandria. This distinction is small in language but enormous in history. A cautious account has to leave space between injury and extinction. Ancient reports suggest that fire during the conflict may have reached stored written materials connected with the harbour, and later writers sometimes described large numbers of books being burned. Yet the details are not steady enough to build a single final scene from them. Some accounts were written long after the event. Some may have repeated earlier claims without seeing the full evidence. Some may have confused warehouses, ships, collected books, or nearby storage with the main scholarly institution itself. The result is not a blank where anything can be invented. It is a field of uncertainty where careful limits are necessary. We can say that Alexandria was vulnerable during Caesar's war. We can say that written materials may have been destroyed. We can say that the famous fire became one layer in the memory of the library's loss. But we should not say with certainty that the entire institution vanished in one night because of that fire. The strongest reason for caution is that Alexandria did not immediately disappear from the learned map. Later intellectual life in the city still mattered. Scholars, teachers, religious thinkers, philosophers, physicians, and commentators continued to be associated with Alexandria in later centuries. That does not prove that the great royal collection remained untouched in its earlier form. It does show that the city's learned identity was not cut off cleanly at the moment of Caesar's fighting. A place can be wounded and still continue. A collection can be reduced and still function. A tradition can lose many works and still leave enough people behind for learning to go on in changed form. Human memory has often survived like this, not as an unbroken wall, but as a damaged path still walked by some feet. In the earliest communities, a fire, flood, migration, or conflict might destroy tools and shelters. Yet if people survived with enough memory in their bodies, many practices could be rebuilt. A tool could be remade if the technique remained alive. A route could be found again if enough elders remembered the land. Writing changed the balance. It allowed more memory to be stored outside the body, but it also meant that some knowledge might be lost if its written carriers were destroyed before the living community had renewed them. Alexandria's problem was therefore not only whether one fire happened, but whether damaged memory could be repaired afterward. If enough copies existed elsewhere, a burned roll might not mean total loss. If a work was rare, the same flame could erase a voice completely. If scholars remained strong, they could restore, copy, and reorganize. If the system around them was already weakening, recovery would be uneven. This is why the debate over Caesar's fire matters less than the condition of the whole chain. A single disaster becomes historically decisive only when there are not enough surviving supports to absorb it. The popular story imagines a library so complete that one fire could erase the ancient mind. The more careful picture is more human. Alexandria was never the only place where knowledge lived, and ancient learning did not depend on one building alone. Greek, Egyptian, Babylonian, Jewish, Roman, and many other traditions moved through different cities, schools, temples, private collections, and later copying networks. Some works associated with ancient learning survived because they travelled, others vanished because they did not. The fire, if it destroyed texts, would have joined a wider pattern of selection and loss that no one controlled completely. What survived was shaped by copying, teaching, language, taste, usefulness, religion, politics, and chance. What disappeared may have disappeared in many different ways. The danger of the one-night story is that it makes the past seem simpler than it was. It gives us a clean wound, but removes the slower illness. Caesar's fire can remain in the story, but it should not be allowed to swallow the story. It was one possible wound among many, and the larger mystery is how many wounds a memory system can suffer before it no longer knows how to heal itself. The reason Caesar's fire became so powerful is not only that it may have burned books, it is that the human mind prefers a visible cause when it faces an invisible loss. A flame gives memory a center. It has shape, motion, brightness, and blame. A slow decline has none of those comforts. It moves through habits too ordinary to become legend. A budget is reduced. A patron looks elsewhere. A scholar leaves. A role is not copied. A room is repaired later than it should be. A language becomes less familiar to the young. None of these moments feels large enough to explain the disappearance of a famous library. But together, over time, they can do what one fire is imagined to have done in a night. This is why the legend is so tempting. It lets people feel that knowledge was lost because of one violent interruption, not because every society struggles to keep its memory alive. The one-night story also protects us from a quieter fear. If a single fire destroyed Alexandria, then the loss belongs safely to the past. It was an accident of war, a mistake made by ancient powers, a tragedy that happened before us. But if the library weakened through neglect, changing priorities, fragile materials, lost teachers, and broken copying chains, then the story comes closer to every human age. It suggests that destruction does not always arrive as an enemy at the gate. Sometimes it arrives as ordinary attention moving elsewhere. That is colder than fire, because it is harder to see while it is happening. From the beginning of our species, memory has always simplified danger in order to survive. A sound in the dark becomes a warning. A scar on the land becomes a remembered place. A story turns a difficult lesson into something a child can carry. This simplification helped human communities live. But when we look back at history, the same habit can make the past too clean. It can turn complicated processes into single scenes, because single scenes are easier to hold in the mind. Alexandria became one of those scenes. A burning library is emotionally complete. It has a victim, a weapon, and a moment of loss. A fading institution asks for more patience. It asks us to think about systems, not just events. It asks us to notice the invisible labour behind survival. The people who copied, catalogued, taught, funded, repaired, and cared. When that labour disappears, there may be no smoke. There may be only fewer voices reaching the future. Caesar's fire should not be erased from the story, because war truly can endanger knowledge without intending to. Battles destroy more than soldiers. They break storage, scatter communities, interrupt schools, and place fragile things in the path of heat and panic. Yet the fire should also not be allowed to become a myth that hides the larger pattern. The Library of Alexandria was not a single object waiting passively for destruction. It was an arrangement of city, court, readers, materials, and generations. A flame could wound that arrangement, but it could not alone explain why later centuries remembered absence more clearly than continuity. The real lesson is not that one man burned the ancient world. It is that human memory often survives or disappears through layers of care too quiet to be celebrated. We remember the fire because it is visible, We forget the copyist because his work was meant to vanish into the survival of the text. We remember the conqueror because his name remained attached to events. We forget the teacher who trained one careful reader and the reader who might have saved one difficult role if the chain had lasted longer. Alexandria's legend is therefore both true and untrue. True, because knowledge can be burned. Untrue, because burning is only one way knowledge dies. The deeper destruction begins when fewer hands remain between the past and silence. After the age of the Ptolemies, Alexandria did not fall out of history. It remained a major city, a port of enormous value, and a place where learning, administration, religion, trade, and conflict continued to meet. This matters because a simple destruction story often makes the city vanish too early. The world did not suddenly stop passing through Alexandria after Caesar's war. Ships still came, grain still moved, officials still governed, teachers still taught. Readers still argued over texts. The city remained alive, but its place inside power had changed. Egypt eventually became part of the Roman world, and Alexandria no longer served in the same way as the proud capital of a Greek dynasty ruling from its own court. It was now tied more directly to an imperial system whose centre lay elsewhere. That shift did not erase learning, but it changed the environment that had once made the Great Collection possible. A royal project built to glorify a dynasty could not mean exactly the same thing once the dynasty was gone. Under Roman rule, Alexandria continued to matter, yet it was now one important city within a wider empire rather than the singular intellectual ornament of Ptolemaic kingship. This is a subtle but important change. A library may survive a change of rulers, but the reasons for supporting it may become weaker, different, or less concentrated. The old courtly motivation to gather, sponsor, and display knowledge could thin into something less focused. Administrators may respect a city's reputation without rebuilding the exact conditions that created it. Emperors and governors may value order, grain supply, taxes, and loyalty before the slow care of inherited writings. None of this requires hostility toward books. It only requires that the library become one concern among many. In such a setting, a famous name could still be honoured while the daily machinery behind that name received less patience than before. In the deep past of human communities, memory also depended on where attention was placed. A group moving into a new landscape had to decide what older knowledge still served survival and what new knowledge had to be learned. Some memories remained vital because water, shelter, food, and danger made them useful every day. Other memories might fade when the landscape, the season, or the group's needs changed. Alexandria experienced a civilized version of that ancient pressure. The written past remained valuable, but the social landscape around it had shifted. The city's memory system now compete with new political demands and new forms of prestige. War and instability added further strain. Alexandria's later history included episodes of unrest, imperial conflict, urban violence, and changing religious life. It would be careless to turn each disturbance into a direct blow against the old library, because the evidence does not always allow such a straight line. But it would also be careless to ignore the wider effect of repeated instability on any centre of learning. Scholarship needs time that feels protected. Copying needs materials, wages, and patient hands. Teaching needs continuity. A city troubled by political violence may still produce brilliant minds, but its institutions can become harder to sustain across generations. The loss of Alexandria should therefore be imagined inside a moving world, not inside a frozen legend. Empires rise around cities and then redirect them. Harbours remain useful while palaces lose old meaning. Scholars continue working while the structures that once gathered them change shape. Some knowledge travels outward and survives in other places. Some remains local and becomes more vulnerable. The Roman world did not simply destroy Alexandria's learning. It absorbed, redirected, and transformed the conditions around it. That transformation is part of the real reason the famous library could fade. The city was not removed from history. It was carried forward into a different history, and in that movement, the old arrangement that had once held so many voices together became harder to keep intact. War changes the meaning of a city even when it does not erase the city. Alexandria under Roman power remained crowded, wealthy, and intellectually active, but it no longer existed inside the same protective imagination that had surrounded the Ptolemaic court. A ruler in Rome or an imperial governor in Egypt could value Alexandria for grain, revenue, order, and strategic position, without feeling the same need to make its learned institutions the shining proof of royal identity. That difference matters. A place can still be important, and yet be important for other reasons. When the highest purpose of a city shifts, the quiet institutions within it have to survive under new priorities. The old library, or what remained of its wider scholarly system, had to live in a world where imperial administration, military security, taxation, and public order often spoke louder than the slow care of scrolls. Alexandria also carried the pressures of a large urban population. It was not a silent sanctuary built only for readers. It was a city of neighborhoods, rival communities, religious traditions, markets, docks, soldiers, officials, and crowds. Urban life can support learning by bringing people together, but it can also endanger learning when conflict enters the streets. Later, Alexandria saw periods of unrest and violence, and the Roman Empire itself passed through civil wars, succession struggles, and political crises. It would be too simple to say that every conflict struck the library directly, but repeated instability can weaken the environment around any institution that depends on patience. Scholars need continuity, copyists need materials and payment, teachers need students who believe that study has a future. A city that must often think about loyalty, security, and survival may still produce learning, but it may struggle to maintain the large, organized memory system that earlier rulers had once advertised as glory. This pattern is older than cities. Early human groups also had to protect knowledge from disruption. If a community was forced to move suddenly, some landscape knowledge became less useful. If conflict scattered families, certain skills might survive in one person but fail to reach the next generation. If hunger narrowed attention, people could not always spend time teaching what was not needed immediately. The human mind carries memory best when life gives it enough stability to repeat, practice, and transmit. Alexandria's written culture was far more complex, but it depended on the same basic condition: enough social calm for knowledge to be renewed. The Roman world created both preservation and risk. On one hand, empire could connect cities and help texts travel. Roads, ships, schools, private libraries, and educated elites allowed some works to move beyond their place of origin. Because knowledge was not trapped in Alexandria alone, some ancient learning survived through other centers and later traditions. On the other hand, the spread of learning also meant that Alexandria's special role became less unique. Intellectual life could grow elsewhere. Scholars might find patrons in other cities. Libraries, schools, and collections could form under different authorities. This movement was not destruction in the obvious sense. It was diffusion. Yet diffusion can weaken a former center if the resources and attention that once gathered there are no longer concentrated. The library's old strength had been density. Many texts, readers, and royal supports close enough to reinforce one another. When that density thinned, the loss did not need to look like catastrophe. It could look like learning continuing, but more scattered. A commentary survives in one place while the work it explained disappears in another. A teaching tradition moves but leaves behind older catalogues. A famous author remains widely copied, while less useful or less fashionable writings quietly fall away. The Roman centuries remind us that the destruction of Alexandria should be placed inside world history, not outside it. Empires do not only burn things, they relocate attention, they reorder value. They make some roads brighter and others dimmer. In that reordered world, the library's fate became tied not to one blade or one torch, but to the slow movement of power away from the exact conditions that had once made such a concentrated memory possible. A library can seem separate from the world because its work is quiet. People read, compare, copy, and teach while outside the windows. Ships arrive, officials argue, soldiers move, taxes are collected and rulers are replaced. Yet no library is truly outside the world that surrounds it. Alexandria's fate has to be placed inside the long movement of Mediterranean history, where power shifted, cities competed, religions changed, and empires learned to use old centers for new purposes. The Great Collection had risen when Alexandria stood at the center of a royal vision. Later, the city remained important, but importance had many meanings. It could mean grain for Rome, a strategic harbour, a place to manage, a place to watch, a place to calm when crowds grew dangerous. Learned prestige still mattered, but it no longer had the same political weight it once held for the dynasty that had built its identity around scholarship. This shift did not need to announce itself as destruction. It could appear as continuation. Alexandria still had schools, teachers, philosophers, physicians, and readers. The city still belonged to the map of learning. But the question is not whether learning survived in any form. The question is whether the older concentration of support, books, scholars, and institutional purpose could remain intact as the world around it changed. A place can keep its name while losing the exact arrangement that made the name powerful. The human past offers many examples of this quieter transformation. A campsite may remain known after the animals have changed routes. A path may still exist after fewer people need to walk it. A ritual may continue after the conditions that once gave it daily force have faded. Human memory often stays attached to places longer than the original purpose of those places survives. Alexandria became one of those places on a grand scale. It carried the memory of universal collection even as the world that had made universal collection possible became harder to sustain. Time itself was one of the pressures. The centuries between the early Ptolemaic age and the later stories of destruction were not empty centuries. They contained wars, reforms, religious transformation, economic strain, conflict, and movement across many cities. Each change may have left only a small mark. Together, they altered the landscape in which old books had to survive. If a collection depended on royal pride, what happened when royal pride no longer took the same form? If scholarship depended on a dense community, what happened when scholars travelled to other centres? If preservation depended on copying, what happened when fewer people chose to copy works that no longer seemed central? These are not dramatic questions, but they are the questions that decide whether memory reaches another age. The earliest human communities also lived under the rule of changing conditions. Knowledge of one valley did not automatically help in another. A technique suited to one material might weaken where that material was rare. A story rooted in one place could lose meaning when a group moved beyond it. Survival required adaptation, but adaptation also meant selection. Some knowledge was carried because it still answered the world. Some knowledge fell behind because the world no longer asked for it in the same way. Alexandria's loss belongs to that larger human pattern. Written knowledge had become more powerful than spoken memory, yet it still needed a world that asked for it, cared for it, and made room for it. When the historical world around Alexandria shifted, the library's old form could not remain untouched. The real destruction was therefore not only a matter of violence, it was also the slow mismatch between a memory system built for one political and cultural order and the changing order that followed. A library may hold the past, but it survives only when the present continues to make space for that past to breathe quietly. The later religious history of Alexandria is one of the most delicate areas in the story because it is easy to turn complexity into blame. By late antiquity, the city was no longer the same world that had produced the early royal library. Christianity had grown in influence, older temple traditions had lost much of their former authority, imperial law and local conflict reshaped public life, and educated culture lived among arguments about truth, worship, philosophy, and power. These changes mattered for the fate of books and institutions, but they should not be told as if one community simply hated knowledge and another community simply protected it. That would be too easy and too false. Religious change in Alexandria was not a single hand reaching for a shelf. It was a transformation of what a city honoured, funded, defended, and allowed to stand at the centre of public meaning. Some pagan philosophical traditions continued for a long time. Christian scholars also preserved, argued with, and transmitted many older texts. Jewish, Greek, Egyptian, and later Christian intellectual worlds overlapped in ways that cannot be reduced to a clean line of destruction. The danger to knowledge came less from belief alone than from the way belief, politics, law, urban rivalry, and authority became joined. When a society changes what it considers sacred, useful, or legitimate, the older places that once held prestige can become vulnerable, even if not every person wishes them harm. A temple can lose protection. A school can lose its place. A library connected with an older institution can become harder to defend. The meaning of a building may change before the stones fall. This pattern reaches back to the earliest human communities. Long before formal religions or libraries, groups protected the things that helped them understand their world. A burial place, a remembered path, a seasonal gathering point, a story about ancestors, a set of gestures around death or birth. Such things were not only practical, they told people who they were. When a group's world changed, its protected places could change too. Some memories were carried forward. Others became strange, dangerous, or irrelevant to descendants living under new pressures. Alexandria in late antiquity shows that same human process on a grand urban scale. The old learned spaces were not just rooms, they were tied to older forms of authority and identity. As the city's religious and political life changed, the protection around such spaces could weaken. This does not mean that every loss should be assigned to faith itself. Many believers valued learning. Many acts of preservation in later centuries happened inside religious communities. But preservation is selective. A text copied in a monastery survives. A text left outside the new circle of value may not. A philosophical work becomes useful if it can be taught, debated, or reconciled with later concerns. Another work may be ignored because few people see a reason to renew it. In that way, religious change can shape memory without behaving like a simple bonfire. Alexandria's later conflicts, including the famous destruction of the Serapeum in the late 4th century, are often pulled into the legend of the library. The Serapeum was associated with older religious life and may have held books or scholarly materials, but it should not be treated as if its destruction automatically proves the final burning of the original Great Library. By that time, the earlier royal institution had likely already changed deeply, perhaps beyond recognition. What the Serapeum story reveals is different, that public spaces connected with older worship and older learning could become exposed when the city's centre of legitimacy moved elsewhere. The real issue is not whether religion alone destroyed Alexandria's memory. The issue is how memory suffers when the structures that once made it honourable no longer command the same loyalty. Knowledge needs guardians, but guardians protect what their world has taught them to value. The Serapeum stands near the edge of the Alexandria story because it is both real and easily misunderstood. It was a major sanctuary connected with the god Serapis, a religious figure whose worship belonged to the mixed world of Greek and Egyptian Alexandria. In late antiquity, as imperial policy and local power moved against older public cults, the Serapeum was destroyed during conflicts that reflected the city's changing religious order. Later imagination often placed the lost library inside that destruction, as if one fallen temple could finally explain the absence of the ancient collection. The temptation is understandable. The Serapeum had prestige. It was connected with learning in some accounts. It may have held books or served as a place where texts were kept, studied, or associated with scholarly life. But caution is necessary. To say that books may have been present there is not the same as saying that the original Royal Library of Alexandria, in its greatest early form, was burned there. By the late 4th century, the older institution had already passed through many centuries of political change, war, shifting patronage, and uncertain survival. What remained may not have matched the famous image people carry in their minds. The Serapeum should therefore be treated not as a simple final answer, but as a window into a later stage of loss. It shows how older religious and intellectual spaces could become exposed when the social world around them no longer protected them. A building once honoured can become a threat in another age. A collection once valued can become secondary when new authorities decide what deserves public care. A statue can fall, a sanctuary can close, and the books connected with that world may lose their safest setting. Yet the story still should not become an accusation against thought itself. Many Christian writers studied grammar, rhetoric, philosophy, medicine, and earlier literature. Many later religious communities preserved texts that might otherwise have vanished. The problem is not that one belief automatically destroys learning. The problem is that all societies preserve selectively. They carry forward what seems useful, sacred, compatible, beautiful, authoritative, or necessary. They neglect what becomes difficult, suspect, expensive, or no longer attached to living teachers. This pattern is as old as human memory. Early groups did not carry every possible skill with equal care. They carried what the landscape, the body, the season, and the group's survival kept asking them to remember. When life changed, some practices stayed alive, while others faded because they no longer had daily guardians. Alexandria's written world followed the same deep rule. A text survived when enough people wanted it to survive in the new order of life. It faded when too few people stood near it. Even the choice to copy one work instead of another was a quiet act of selection, shaped by education, belief, usefulness, and available time. The Serapeum's fall, then, should be understood as one sign of a wider transformation. Older public institutions no longer held the same authority. The relationship between learning, worship, and civic identity had changed. Scrolls did not need to be hated in order to become unsafe. They only needed to be attached to places no longer defended with the same conviction. If books were lost there, the loss would have been serious. But the meaning of that loss lies in the surrounding change, the weakening of a world where certain kinds of learning had once been sheltered. A later reader may look for one clear ending, but the evidence points toward layers rather than a single door closing. The Serapeum belongs to those layers. It reminds us that memory can be displaced when the buildings that once framed it lose moral and political protection. Alexandria's memory did not vanish because every later reader rejected the past. It thinned because the past was sorted through new priorities, and whatever fell outside those priorities became more vulnerable to silence. The most dangerous change for a library is not always the arrival of open hostility. Sometimes it is the loss of priority. A place can pass from being protected to being merely tolerated, and from being tolerated to being forgotten, before anyone thinks of it as destroyed. Alexandria's later history shows this quiet movement. The older learned world had been tied to royal prestige, temple culture, Greek education, civic identity, and the belief that gathering old texts gave a city honor. As late antiquity unfolded, those anchors shifted. New religious authorities, new imperial laws, new public values, and new forms of learning changed what people thought deserved protection. This does not mean knowledge itself disappeared, or that later believers were enemies of thought. Learning continued in many forms. Christian scholars argued, preserved, interpreted, and transmitted texts. Philosophical schools remained active in different ways. Medicine, grammar, mathematics, and rhetoric did not simply fall silent, but the social shelter around certain older institutions changed. And when shelter changes, fragile things feel the weather first. The fate of Alexandria is therefore not only a question of fire, it is a question of cultural oxygen. What is allowed to breathe? What is kept warm? What is copied again before it decays? What is left in a room whose meaning no longer feels central to the people who govern the city? A scroll does not know why it is neglected. It only ages. A catalogue does not defend itself. It only becomes less useful when fewer readers know how to follow it. A building does not preserve its former purpose by standing upright. It needs a living community to say, again and again, this still matters. That rule reaches back to the earliest human memory. Before writing, a story, a skill, or a warning survived because a group continued to attach value to it. If a certain path led to water, it was taught. If a tool-making gesture helped hands cut, scrape, or shape, it was repeated. If a burial custom carried identity, it was protected. Nothing survived because it was old alone. It survived because the living still gave it space. Written culture did not escape that ancient law. Alexandria only made it larger and more delicate. The city could gather voices from many places, but those voices remained dependent on later people deciding that they were worth hearing. When religious and political life changed, some texts found new readers because they could be used, debated, translated, or reconciled with new concerns. Others stood farther from the new center of attention. They may not have been condemned, they may simply have been left uncopied. And in a manuscript culture, to be left uncopied for long enough was almost another form of death. This is why simple blame is dangerous. It hides the real mechanism. Human societies do not preserve the past evenly. They filter it through need, belief, cost, language, education, and authority. The later city did not inherit Alexandria's earlier memory system unchanged. It inherited ruins of support, scattered reputations, living schools, older prestige, religious conflict, and fragile texts whose futures depended on the choices of people who could not save everything. The Serapeum's destruction belongs to this changed world, not as an easy answer to the whole mystery, but as an example of how a place once protected by older meaning could become exposed. The deeper loss was not only that some objects may have been broken or books may have vanished, it was that the old reasons for guarding them had weakened. Once a society stops seeing a certain memory as central to itself, that memory begins to stand farther from care. Alexandria's tragedy is that a city created to gather the human past eventually became a place where much of that past had to compete with newer claims on truth, loyalty, and public life. The real destruction was not belief replacing knowledge, it was protection becoming selective, and the unprotected edges of memory slowly falling away. What was actually lost at Alexandria should not be imagined as a locked room full of secret machines or modern discoveries waiting to be revealed. That is the tempting version, because it makes the loss feel sharp and useful in a simple way. But the more honest loss is quieter, broader, and harder to measure. Many ancient works that disappeared were likely not miraculous keys to a hidden future. Some may have been poems, local histories, dramas, speeches, commentaries, lists, observations, philosophical arguments, mathematical discussions, medical notes, religious writings, or copies of copies whose importance could only be known inside the world that produced them. The tragedy is not that every missing scroll would have transformed human civilization. The tragedy is that we cannot know which missing voices might have changed one argument, corrected one assumption, preserved one vanished community, or shown one different path of thought. A lost text removes more than its conclusions. It removes the route by which a mind reached those conclusions. It removes examples, doubts, errors, comparisons, and the texture of a world thinking with the evidence available to it. In a library like Alexandria, the most valuable thing may have been not only individual books, but the relationships among them. A work could survive in one version, while other versions disappeared. A famous author could remain, while rivals or critics vanished. A scientific idea could reach later centuries as a result, while the observations, debates, and failed alternatives behind it were lost. A catalogue could record that a work existed, but if the work itself was gone, the title became a doorway without a room. This is a loss of depth. It leaves later generations with fragments that may look cleaner than the ancient conversation really was. From the beginning of human memory, communities did not only pass down answers, they passed down ways of noticing. A hunter did not merely say that an animal had gone east. He taught others how to read broken grass, pressure in mud, wind, smell, silence, and the behavior of birds. A tool maker did not only hand over a finished blade, she taught angles, pressure, patience, and the feeling of stone giving way. When that deeper method disappears, the object left behind becomes thinner. Alexandria's written world worked in a similar way. A surviving conclusion without its commentary is like a tool without the hand that explains it. A quoted line without its wider argument is like a track with the landscape erased. What was lost forever may have included entire works, but also the connective tissue around works. Marginal notes, scholarly corrections, alternative readings, teaching traditions, lists of authors, local records, and careful disagreements. These are not dramatic treasures in the popular sense. They are the slow tissue of knowledge. They show how people learn to compare, revise, and doubt. They help a culture remember not only what it believed, but how it came to believe it. When such tissue disappears, history becomes more silent and more confident at the same time. We may inherit a few strong voices while losing the chorus that once surrounded them. We may mistake survival for importance, because what survives is what we can see. But survival is shaped by chance, copying, taste, politics, language, and usefulness. The missing majority cannot defend itself. Alexandria's loss therefore asks for humility. It does not prove that ancient people knew everything we have forgotten. It shows something more human, that even careful societies leave most of their thinking exposed to time, and because the exposure is uneven, Later, people inherit not the full human conversation, but a shoreline after the tide has gone out. The forever lost is not a single secret. It is the immense number of human attempts that no longer have enough words left to answer us, even when their silence still shapes the questions we are able to ask today. It would be misleading to speak of Alexandria as if all ancient knowledge died there. The loss was real, but it was not total. Many Greek works survived because they had already travelled beyond Egypt. Some were copied in other cities, studied in schools, quoted by later writers, translated into other languages, or preserved through traditions that did not depend on one building. Mathematics, medicine, philosophy, astronomy, grammar, poetry, and history continued after Alexandria's decline, though often in altered forms. The ancient world did not become silent all at once, and later civilizations did not begin again from nothing. This matters because exaggeration can make the story feel larger, while making it less truthful. If we imagine that the burning or fading of Alexandria erased the whole mind of antiquity, we misunderstand both the strength and the fragility of human memory. The strength was that knowledge had many paths. The fragility was that not every path had enough copies, readers, or reasons to continue. A famous work could survive because teachers kept assigning it. A useful medical text might be copied because healers still needed it. A philosophical argument might travel because later thinkers found it worth answering. But another work, perhaps less fashionable, less useful, more local, more difficult, or written in a tradition fewer people understood, could disappear without anyone in the future knowing what had been lost. This uneven survival is one of the deepest truths behind Alexandria. What reaches us is not the ancient world as it was. It is the ancient world after centuries of selection. Some selection was deliberate. People chose what to copy, teach, translate, and preserve. Some selection was accidental. A role survived because it sat in a dry place. A work vanished because its only copy decayed. A quotation endured because one later author included it for his own purpose. A name was remembered because it entered a list, while another name fell away without even leaving a shadow. Human culture has always worked like this. From the earliest communities, knowledge survived through repeated usefulness and shared attention. A method of finding water was carried because bodies needed water. A way of shaping a tool continued because hands still needed an edge. A story about danger stayed alive because fear made it necessary. But not every memory could be carried. If a group moved into a new landscape, some older knowledge lost its place. If a small band joined another group, some customs blended while others faded. Survival required memory, but it also required forgetting. Written civilization did not remove that condition. It only made the choices larger and less visible. Alexandria tried to resist forgetting by gathering more than one community could naturally carry. Yet even there, preservation remained selective. The real loss was not that all wisdom vanished. It was that the surviving record became narrower than the living conversation had once been. Later readers may inherit Aristotle, but not every critic who answered him. Euclid, but not every mathematical path that failed or flourished nearby. Famous poets, but not the full landscape of performance. Ordinary voices, local memories, or rival versions. To lose those does not mean that human progress stopped. It means that our picture of the past became less crowded, less uncertain, and perhaps less honest than the past itself. Alexandria's silence is therefore not an empty hole where everything disappeared. It is a damaged archive around which many other archives continued breathing. Some branches of knowledge lived on, sometimes through Roman, Byzantine, Syriac, Arabic, Jewish, Christian, and later European channels. Their survival should be honoured, because it shows how resilient human transmission can be. But the missing branches matter too. A tree can keep growing after many limbs are cut, yet its shape is changed forever. The real thing lost at Alexandria was not the whole tree of knowledge. It was part of the branching. The hardest loss to understand is the loss that leaves no edge. If a surviving writer names a missing work, we can at least feel the outline of absence. A title remains, like a stone marker where a house once stood. If a later author quotes one sentence from a vanished book, the sentence becomes a small window, narrow but real. But many works leave no title, no quotation, no complaint, no memory that later hands could pass forward. They disappear so completely that history cannot even count them among the missing. This is the deepest silence around Alexandria. Not every lost voice became famous enough to be mourned. Not every record entered a catalogue that survived. Not every local history, technical note, play, poem, map, or argument left a trace in another writer's work. Some may have existed only in one place, or in a few fragile copies, or inside a learned circle that ended before its words could travel. Once those circles faded, their memory fell below the surface of history. We can speak carefully about broad categories of loss, but we cannot reconstruct the full shape of what vanished. That uncertainty is not empty. It is part of the truth. Human beings often want lost knowledge to become a clear inventory. So many books, so many discoveries, so many answers gone. Yet the ancient record does not allow such precision. What was lost forever may include things we would consider minor, and things we might have considered profound. It may include errors that would have shown how ancient thinkers struggled. It may include observations that were careful but incomplete. It may include local memories of communities whose own written traces did not survive elsewhere. It may include alternative theories that later traditions did not copy because they seemed wrong, difficult, unfashionable, or no longer useful. Even wrong ideas can matter, because they reveal the paths human minds tried before later knowledge took another direction. The beginning of human knowledge was never a straight road. Early communities learned by trial, correction, repetition, and loss. A group might discover a useful method and then abandon it when the environment changed. A technique might vanish if too few people practiced it. A story might shift so much in memory that its earlier form could never be recovered. Alexandria's written world was different in scale, but not different in principle. It preserved many roads of thought, and it likely lost many roads before later generations could see where they led. The phrase "lost forever" should therefore be handled with humility. It does not mean we know exactly what was lost. It means we know that some losses passed beyond recovery. A missing scroll might have contained a work copied nowhere else. A lost commentary might have explained a surviving author in ways that would change how we read him. A missing catalogue might have named hundreds of works that later people never knew to search for. A lost set of observations might have shown how ancient physicians, astronomers, engineers, or geographers gathered evidence before modern methods existed. But we should not turn these possibilities into claims. It is more honest to say that Alexandria represents the boundary of our knowledge about knowledge itself. We know enough to understand that something large was lost. We do not know enough to make that loss into a list of hidden miracles. This makes the tragedy quieter, but more real. A civilization does not need to lose a secret technology for its loss to matter. It is enough to lose the record of how human beings once asked questions. It is enough to lose the voices that disagreed with the voices that survived. It is enough to lose the small bridges between one idea and another, so that later history appears smoother than it was. When we look back, the surviving past can seem orderly because the disorder did not make it through. But ancient minds were not living inside a finished museum. They were searching, testing, arguing, observing, remembering, and sometimes misunderstanding. The lost material around Alexandria would have shown that movement more fully. It would have made the ancient world less silent and less simple. What vanished forever then was not only information, it was density. It was the crowded human texture of thought before selection, decay, belief, and chance narrowed it into the record we now inherit. Human knowledge survives less like treasure sealed in a room than like a living lineage. It has ancestors, descendants, weak links, sudden losses, and long stretches where nothing dramatic seems to happen while continuity is quietly being kept alive. A scroll is visible, but the life of the scroll is not only in plant fibre and ink. It is in the sequence of people who can read it, value it, copy it, question it, and carry it into another age. When that sequence is strong, fragile material may outlive its expected body. When the sequence breaks, even a famous work can become unreachable, then unknown, then absent from shared memory. Alexandria is powerful because it shows knowledge behaving almost like inheritance, but with one important difference. Biological inheritance passes through bodies without asking whether a child understands it. Cultural inheritance does not. It must be taught, chosen, repeated, and renewed. A community must decide, openly or silently, what deserves to be carried. That decision may be wise, careless, forced, or invisible, but it is always happening. The library gathered inherited voices, yet gathering them did not make them immortal. They still needed descendants in the form of readers. They still needed future minds willing to receive them. The beginning of human life as a cultural creature was built on this same principle. Long before written records, a group survived because knowledge moved from older bodies into younger ones. How to shape a cutting edge, how to recognize safe food, how to move through darkness, how to remember water, how to share danger without panic. These things did not live alone, they lived in practice. If the people who knew a skill failed to teach it, the skill could die, even while stones, bones, or paths remained. Archaeology may find an object, but not always the full chain of learning that made it meaningful. Alexandria enlarged that ancient chain until it reached across seas and centuries. The teacher was no longer only a living elder. It could be a writer dead for hundreds of years. The student might never know the writer's face, homeland, voice, or body, yet a connection could still occur through marks on papyrus if enough people kept those marks alive. Written knowledge was therefore a cultural lineage with material ancestors. Each copy was a descendant of an older copy. Each commentary was a child of an earlier question. Each catalogue was a family tree of names, titles, and intellectual relationships. To lose such things was not only to lose objects, it was to lose ancestry. This is why the destruction of Alexandria should not be imagined only as the disappearance of stored information. It was the weakening of lines of descent. Some lines survived because they found other shelters. A text moved to another city. A teaching tradition entered another school. A work was quoted, translated, summarized, or absorbed into later thought. Other lines ended quietly. The last copy aged. The last reader died. The last teacher failed to find a successor. The last quotation became too small to restore the larger work. In living nature, an extinct lineage leaves no living descendants, though traces may remain. In cultural life, extinction can be stranger. A lost work may leave influence without a name, a phrase without context, or a reputation without the writing itself. Its body is gone, but its shadow may have entered later ideas in ways no one can fully separate. That makes Alexandria not only a historical loss, but a lesson in how memory behaves. Human beings do not inherit a complete past. We inherit a selected past, shaped by copying, usefulness, admiration, power, chance, and neglect. What reaches us is not everything that once lived. It is what found descendants. Everything else remains beyond the family of memory, not because it never mattered, but because no living line carried it forward far enough. Human beings survive with two kinds of inheritance. One moves through blood, bodies, birth, and the long biological history that no person chooses. The other moves through learning. It is carried in words, tools, habits, songs, measurements, warnings, recipes, maps, laws, stories, and written marks left for minds not yet alive. Alexandria belonged to that second inheritance. It was not a place where genes were protected. It was a place where experience was gathered outside the body, so that one life might begin where another life had ended. This is one of the most important differences between humans and other animals. Many creatures learn, remember, and teach in limited ways, but human culture can accumulate with unusual depth. A person can use a method invented centuries earlier. A doctor can read an observation made by someone whose bones have long since disappeared. A sailor can follow a map shaped by older journeys. A scholar can answer an argument written before his grandparents were born. Knowledge becomes a shelter built across time. Yet that shelter is never automatic. It has to be repaired by every generation that enters it. At the beginning of human life, before cities and libraries, this second inheritance lived close to the skin. A child learned how to hold a tool because another hand demonstrated pressure and angle. A young person learned where danger might wait because someone repeated a warning with enough seriousness to be remembered. A group learned how to survive a hard season because earlier hunger had been turned into instruction. Nothing was stored in a separate institution. But memory was already larger than one body. Culture allowed one person's experience to become another person's starting point. Writing made that ancient pattern wider. It turned memory into something that could sit in a room, cross water, enter a palace, or outlive the voice that first formed it. Alexandria magnified this power by gathering texts from many places into one learned environment. It was a human attempt to make accumulated experience visible, but the same act revealed a new weakness. Once knowledge lived outside the body, it could be separated from the people who understood it. A scroll could remain while its method faded. A sentence could survive while the teaching tradition around it disappeared. A catalogue could name works that no reader could recover. Biological inheritance is transmitted by reproduction, but cultural inheritance depends on attention. If attention moves away, the line weakens. That is why the real loss of Alexandria is tied to more than burned books. It is tied to the failure of continuation. A written work needs a future reader almost as a child needs a future world. Without readers, it becomes a silent object. Without teachers, it becomes harder to enter. Without copying, it ages toward disappearance. Without social value, it stands outside protection. Human beings learn to place memory in things, but the things still needed human care. This is the quiet lesson hidden behind the library's fame. We often imagine knowledge as if it naturally increases, as if what has been learned remains safely behind us forever. History shows otherwise. Knowledge can accumulate, but it can also narrow. It can be preserved in one language and lost in another. It can survive as a conclusion while losing the questions that made it meaningful. It can travel through a powerful school and leave smaller voices behind. Alexandria was not the only holder of ancient learning, but it became a symbol of the risk inside all cultural inheritance. Our species became strong because it could remember beyond the body. But every memory placed beyond the body also entered the world of weather, war, politics, belief, cost, and neglect. What humans store outside themselves can outlive them, yet only if other humans keep returning to it with care. Alexandria shows a painful difference between discovering knowledge and keeping it. A civilization may learn something with care, record it with patience, and still fail to carry it safely into the future. This is not because people of the past were foolish, or because later generations were always careless. It is because knowledge does not preserve itself. A measured observation, a poem, a map, a medical note, or a careful argument has no power to demand its own survival. It waits for people to return. It waits for a reader with enough training, a copyist with enough time, a teacher with enough patience, and a society with enough reason to make room for it. If those conditions fade, what was once known can become almost as unreachable as something never known at all. This is the quiet force behind the Library of Alexandria. The tragedy is not only that books were lost, it is that human beings had already built ways of remembering beyond one life, and those ways still remained fragile. Long before writing, our ancestors survived because memory could move. One person learned from another. A tool-making gesture passed from hand to hand. A warning about hunger, weather, darkness, or dangerous animals entered the habits of the young. Knowledge was never perfect, but it stayed close to use. If people needed it every day, they repeated it every day. Writing changed the rhythm. It allowed knowledge to rest outside immediate use. It could wait in silence for a future mind. That was a great strength. But it also meant that memory could appear safe while slowly losing the living attention that kept it alive. Alexandria gathered this risk on a large scale. In its strongest form, it represented the belief that human thought could be collected, compared, corrected, and extended. It suggested that the dead could speak to the unborn through carefully preserved words. But no library, however ambitious, can escape the conditions of history. War can interrupt it. Politics can redirect it. New beliefs can reorder what is valued. Money can run out. Languages can shift. Schools can move. Copying can slow. A work can survive one danger and disappear in another. The loss does not always come as an attack on knowledge. Sometimes it comes as a failure of return. No one comes back to the shelf in time. No one makes the next copy. No one teaches the difficult method. No one remembers why an old argument once mattered. This is why Alexandria remains more than an ancient mystery. It is a mirror of the way cultural memory works. Human beings can accumulate knowledge faster than any one person can understand it, but accumulation creates its own burden. The more a society knows, the more it must decide what to renew. Some things are copied because they are famous, some because they are useful, some because they fit the values of a later age. Others fall away because they are strange, costly, difficult, or simply unlucky. What disappears may not be the most important thing, or the least important thing. It may disappear before anyone has the chance to judge it fairly. Alexandria's real warning is therefore calm but severe. A civilization can lose not only because it lacks knowledge, but because it cannot maintain the chain that keeps knowledge alive. It can inherit a great store of memory and still allow pieces of that memory to drift beyond reach. What was actually lost forever may never be counted, but the mechanism of loss is visible enough. Fragile materials, changing institutions, selective attention, and generations that could not carry every voice forward. The library was not only destroyed when things burned or broke. It was destroyed whenever a known thing stopped finding a living path into tomorrow. The real reason the Library of Alexandria was destroyed cannot be held in one hand. It was not only fire, not only conquest, not only religion, not only neglect, and not only time. It was the meeting of many ordinary vulnerabilities around an extraordinary human ambition. The library tried to gather memory beyond the limits of one body, one city, one ruler, and one generation. But everything that made it possible also made it fragile. Its scrolls were made of perishable material. Its scholars needed protection. Its copyists needed support. Its catalogues needed care. Its buildings needed maintenance. Its authority needed rulers who still believed that old words strengthen the present. Its texts needed readers who could understand them, teachers who could explain them, and students who would carry them forward. When any one of these weakened, the system could recover. When many weakened across centuries, destruction no longer needed a single final day. It could arrive as a slow failure of renewal. That is why the popular image of one burning library is too small for the real loss. A flame may have damaged books in one moment. Political violence may have wounded the city in another. Later conflicts may have exposed old sanctuaries and learned spaces. Changes in religion, power, funding, language, and education may have shifted protection away from what earlier generations had honoured. None of these forces alone explains everything. Together, they show how a memory system can come apart. Alexandria was not just a victim of one attack. It was a living arrangement placed inside history, and history kept moving. This is connected to the beginning of human life in a deep way. Our earliest ancestors did not preserve knowledge by locking it away. They preserved it by repeating it. A skill lived because hands taught hands. A warning lived because voices taught younger ears what to fear and what to notice. A path lived because feet returned often enough to keep it known. When writing appeared, memory became wider, quieter, and more ambitious. A thought could wait outside the body. Alexandria carried that ambition almost to its ancient limit. It tried to make the written past available to the living mind, but it still depended on the same old law. What is not renewed is eventually lost. The library's destruction, then, was not only a collapse of walls or shelves, it was the failure of many renewals at once. A scroll not recopied, a teacher not replaced, a collection not repaired, a language not learned deeply enough by the next generation, a ruler with other priorities, a city under pressure, a world changing its centre of attention. These are quiet events, but quiet events can decide the fate of memory. They do not leave the satisfying outline of a single villain. They leave a more useful lesson. Knowledge survives only when people build conditions for it to survive. Alexandria's story becomes more truthful when it is allowed to be complex. Caesar's fire may belong to it, but it does not own it. The Serapeum may belong to it, but it does not explain all of it. Religious change belongs to it, but so do politics, material decay, economics, war, copying habits, and the movement of scholars through time. What actually destroyed the library was a long exposure to the weaknesses of every human system that tries to protect memory. It was not one door closing. It was many doors becoming harder to open, until fewer and fewer voices could pass through them into the future. Some doors led to texts. Some led to teachers. Some led to habits of careful doubt. Some led to the trust that old knowledge deserved space beside new demands. When those doors narrowed, the library did not have to vanish at once. It could become smaller inside the memory of the world and still leave no single clean ending. The useful lesson from Alexandria is not that the past should be worshipped, or that every old text must be treated as wisdom. Some ancient writings were mistaken. Some were narrow, local, repetitive, or shaped by assumptions later evidence would challenge. The value of preservation is not that everything old is true. Its value is that human beings understand themselves better when they can see how other minds tried to make sense of the world before them. A lost work may have contained knowledge. It may also have contained error. But even error can teach, because it shows the shape of a question, the limits of an age, and the path by which thought moved before later people corrected it. Alexandria matters because it reminds us that memory is not the same as certainty. Memory is the ground on which correction becomes possible. Without records, each generation is tempted to believe it stands alone, wiser than the darkness behind it. With records, a generation can see both achievement and failure, both courage and confusion, both insight and blindness. That is why the loss of a library is more than the loss of objects. It is the narrowing of human self-knowledge. From the beginning of our species, learning was never pure possession. A child did not inherit skill by owning a tool. The child inherited skill by entering a relationship with those who knew how to use it. The same was true for fire, shelter, food, movement, danger, and care for the dead. Knowledge became useful when it was held inside a community that could test it against life. Writing expanded that community across time. It allowed the living to sit quietly with the dead. It allowed one generation to ask, what did they notice? What did they miss? What did they fear? What did they preserve? And what did they fail to understand? Alexandria was one of the ancient world's great attempts to make that conversation larger. Its loss should not leave us only with sorrow. It should leave us with responsibility. A culture that wants to keep knowledge alive must support more than storage. It must support readers who are patient enough to understand context. It must support teachers who can pass on difficult methods without turning them into slogans. It must support copying, translation, cataloguing, repair, and honest doubt. It must accept that preservation is slow work, often invisible, and rarely rewarded with immediate glory. The people who save memory are not always the people whose names become famous. Sometimes they are scribes, librarians, editors, translators, teachers, and ordinary readers who keep one small bridge from collapsing. Their work matters because human knowledge is too large for any one life. The lesson also reaches into the present without needing to become alarmist. Modern societies store more information than ancient people could have imagined, but storage is still not the same as understanding. A file unread is not so different in principle from a scroll uncopied. A record without context can survive and still become mute. A society flooded with information can still lose wisdom if it stops teaching people how to read carefully, compare sources, remember limits, and care for what cannot be replaced. Alexandria does not tell us that all is doomed. It tells us that knowledge needs caretakers in every age. The educational value of its story is calm but strong. What we inherit is not guaranteed, and what we fail to renew may leave without asking permission. The library's fate invites a quieter kind of gratitude for every surviving text, every preserved fragment, every careful translation, and every teacher who helps the past remain open without pretending that the past was perfect. To protect memory is not to freeze human thought. It is to keep enough of the human conversation alive, so that future minds can continue it with humility. At the end, the Library of Alexandria leaves us with a kind of silence that cannot be filled by certainty. We can name some possible wounds. We can speak of fire, war, changing rulers, fragile papyrus, weakened patronage, religious transformation, scattered scholars, and the difficulty of copying old words before they decayed. We can say that the popular image of one sudden destruction is too small for the evidence. We can say that the deeper loss was a slow failure of protection, around a living memory system. But we cannot stand in the lost rooms, unroll the vanished texts, or hear the voices that no later writer carried forward. The honest ending is therefore not a final answer, but a clearer way of asking. Alexandria was destroyed when the chain between past and future became too weak to hold everything it had gathered. Some links broke in violence, some broke in neglect, some broke because the world changed around them, some broke so quietly that no one left a record of the breaking. This is why the story remains powerful after so many centuries. It is not only about ancient Egypt, kings, Roman politics, or late antique conflict. It is about the human condition of remembering. From the beginning, our species lived by receiving what others had learned. No child began from nothing. Hands taught hands. Voices carried warnings. Elders passed on roots, tools, stories, and names. Writing widened that inheritance, but it never made it safe forever. A written memory still needed living care. Alexandria tried to gather more voices than any single community could hold, and in doing so, it revealed both the beauty and the danger of human knowledge. We can build shelters for thought, but shelters must be maintained. We can collect the past, but collection is not the same as continuation. We can admire wisdom, but admiration alone does not copy a fading page, teach a difficult language, or protect an unpopular question. The real loss, then, is not only the missing books. It is the missing relationship between those books and the future readers who never arrived. Somewhere in that silence may have been a forgotten poem, a careful observation, a local history, a flawed theory, a map, a correction, a disagreement, or a record of ordinary people whose world is now beyond recovery. Not all of it would have been true, not all of it would have been great, but together it would have made the human past more crowded, more uncertain, and more alive. The value of Alexandria is that it teaches humility without despair. It reminds us that knowledge is not a possession once captured. It is a responsibility renewed in time. What survives deserves gratitude, but what does not survive deserves reverence too, because its absence tells us how limited every inheritance is. We live inside a selected memory, not a complete one. We speak with the voices that reached us while countless others remain beyond hearing. The quiet lesson is not to mourn endlessly, but to care more for what can still be cared for. Records, languages, stories, questions, and the patience needed to understand them. Every age has its own Alexandria, not necessarily a building with scrolls, but a fragile meeting place where memory waits for attention. Some of those meeting places are libraries, some are archives, some are small languages, family histories, neglected communities, old tools, songs, field notes, and ways of seeing the world that can disappear if no one returns to them. The ancient library asks us to notice that loss before it becomes beautiful, only because it is gone. And as we leave Alexandria in the dark, with the sea still moving beyond the city and the unwritten names resting somewhere outside our reach, the last question is not only what was lost forever, but what else are we quietly failing to carry forward?